Great. Okay, so we've got maybe one more person who will join us here in a minute, but thank you everybody for being here in August. We haven't met in a little bit. I think last adventure was in June for our tour, and then prior to that, we met in May as a full UPAG committee. So welcome to the City of Bend Utility Public Advisory Group subcommittee meeting for August. We're going to reconvene the larger group here in September, first Wednesday per usual, but appreciate everybody being willing to take a deeper dive today into some fun topics. We're going to keep to our 11 to 12:30 timeframe, and we're going to start off with some information from Elizabeth on underground injection control specifications, and then we're going to shift over to the stormwater master plan team. And I'm just, while we still got videos in front of folks, maybe I'll say, so Lori and Austin are there together in the room. Also from the city team, Elizabeth, of course, who everybody knows. I think that's our full staff crew today. And then Trista Kabluski from OTAC, who is representing the Stormwater Master Plan team. And also from that team, we have Karina Nordal and we have Casey McGuire with GSI. So those are going to be some of the folks chatting today through our topics. And I'm Aubrey, per usual, helping just to facilitate the conversation. So I think we are ready to roll. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the slides here. And we ran through this already, but purpose today and agenda, you guys all saw it in the packet. If you are interested in that background information, there's a great memo from GSI that we're going to use as kind of a conversation starter for the latter part of the meeting, and that's in the packet. And there's also a matrix, a CIP matrix. So if you have that handy or on your desktop or printed somewhere, that'll be good for our meeting content today. All right, so Elizabeth.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to the extra meeting today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some specifications for UIC installation and preface it with the concept that some of this stuff will also play into the deep dry well siting conversation as part of the master plan. So I don't have, finalized UIC specifications today. I was hoping to have more of a conversation with the subcommittee members and get more input from them first. So we can go to the next slide. So just a quick background, what we talked about earlier this year, the 2024 groundwater protectiveness study, we were looking at assessing newer emerging contaminants, including PFAS, and looking at if it was feasible or not to change the current setbacks that we have for UIC systems in the city, given all of our increased growth and densification and having challenges kind of citing these types of utilities for stormwater. And so that study, the new study used a model. It determined new setbacks until concentrations could decline to zero, or what we call zero, which was the detection limit for them when they're infiltrating. So we have new vertical and horizontal setbacks that we got from this study that much of what gets changed will be based on these, at least the minimums for these. So we can go to the next slide. This is just a reminder, it was also talked about a lot in the study that we do have 2 areas of perched groundwater in Bend that sit higher than the regional aquifer, and they also ended up with slightly different setback needs in this study because of the nature of them being closer to the surface of the water, or to the surface, land surface, but they are physically separated from the regional groundwater table. Next slide. Oh. And so for those perched areas, they're the 2 different locations I mentioned. The one in the north part of town is roughly 110 feet below ground, that perched area. And then the Old Mill District is much shallower. You can hit that perched groundwater zone around 10 feet below ground. And then comparing this to the regional aquifer, anywhere between 300 to 750 feet below ground for the rest of the city. Okay, now next slide. And then just a summary of some of the report highlights. So the report found that because of that distance we have to the regional aquifer used for drinking water, we're not seeing those newer contaminants being able to reach the groundwater table. So that first bullet relates to that third bullet for the unsaturated zone, which is the most lenient horizontal setback that the study reported, which was 29 feet. So if you're not in the perched areas, the minimum horizontal setback of UICs from drinking water wells would be 29 feet. And then in those perched areas, the required setbacks were a bit higher. So in North Bend, it was around 75 feet, and the old mill was about 100 feet. And we're not really looking at the Simazine one because the setbacks were even lower. So we want to go with the more protective number. And so the italicized text below here were kind of the final recommendations of the study to the city, with those 75-foot and around 100-foot setbacks in the perched areas, with the caveat that there's already an existing Oregon Health Authority setback requirement of 100 feet between stormwater systems and water wells. So the recommendation was to maybe just adopt that 100-foot setback since that's already a requirement. And what happens is that is really only checked when a new well is installed, not when other things are installed around the well by OHA. So to kind of remain consistent, it'd probably be good for the city to go with that 100-foot setback, even though it's a bit higher than the two perched areas and quite a bit higher than the unsaturated zone 29-foot setback.
Yep. I think, Liz, this is Brian. I think that's right with the staying with the OAR for the 100 feet. I would just, does that clarify, is that just public water wells or any drinking water well, which would be potentially a private one also?
I believe that applies to any water well, but I'd have to double check.
Okay, and I'm not saying that. I think that might also be good guidance or requirement. Also, I just trying to clarify if it's only public or public and private.
I think it's both, because everything in the past, and again to clarify, but it was 2-year time of travel when we're talking about city public wells, and then it was 500 feet originally from other domestic wells, now looking at 100 feet. So I'm 90% certain it's all drinking water wells, but we can confirm.
Okay, no, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good questions. I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, so this information is newer since the last time we talked about this topic. Had a conversation with Kevin Weberling from DEQ, kind of talking through how this new protectiveness study would work for the city in relation to what DEQ approves for private UICs. So basically what he told us was that DEQ for privately owned UICs, they cannot change the OAR setbacks that are listed in the Oregon administrative rules. So if you want a rule authorized UIC, you still would need to meet that 500-foot horizontal setback, 100-foot deep maximum outside 2-year time of travel, which is listed for rule authorization. Initially, we had thought that they would be able to accept our protectiveness study for everything, but they can't really do that if you're being rule authorized. So if there was a private development that wanted to have to reference our study and use less strict setbacks, maybe that 100-foot horizontal, they would need to apply for a private or an individual or a general permit, so which is separate from rule authorization, costs more money, requires more kind of management of annual monitoring and reporting. So that was new information that we got from DEQ.
And I think we should be clear that city-owned UICs also includes ones that might be built by a developer, but will ultimately be owned by the city. So quite often they might build them in what will become a street right-of-way. Those our new standards would apply to, but not things that will be permanently owned by a private owner.
Correct. So anything city owned and operated, whether or not it was installed by the city or part of a development project that they then handed over to the city, all those city ones we can use our protectiveness demonstration and whatever specifications we make around that right away. It's really more related to the private development side where it would still be restricted unless you do like additional steps, additional costs to get a separate permit. I think next slide, I think we have some questions. Oh no, we have the implications. So like I mentioned, I just went on DEQ's website just to see kind of the costs for what this means for private development. So if they went with an individual permit, that has a pretty large application fee and annual fee. This is kind of what the city has for their system. For a general permit, you have to have less than 50 UIC systems. It's a bit cheaper, but it's not as cheap as rural authorization, which is, I think I wrote $134 per UIC. And then with both of these, if private development wanted either the individual or general permit, it would also have monitoring and reporting requirements to DEQ. So it's kind of like it's something that's probably not feasible for a typical private development, maybe more for like a large commercial property that would be able to handle this kind of management. But that would be the option if reduced setback standards were wanting to be used by private development.
Yeah, Austin and I were just like going, wow, at these numbers. I mean, I think it largely makes it for private development. You know, you're going to want to go with rural authorization where it's cheap, or do some sort of surface management of stormwater, because our new standards won't be able to apply for those.
Does anyone have questions so far? We can go to our focus questions. So the first one we had was, how can the changes I just talked about between the private and city-owned UICs be best communicated to developers? And then if any of you have experience with obtaining those individual or general UIC permits for a private development project, just wanted to see if anyone had done that before in Bend and how it went and what your experience was.
I'm pretty sure, it's Brian again, I'm pretty sure that we did a individual permit for a multifamily development in Redmond. And the reason was I think it was probably a well setback issue. It wasn't difficult to do. And it certainly, I mean, the numbers that you're putting up there for not the individual permit, but was there was a second option there. What was it again?
The general permit?
Yeah, it was like $1,000 a year. But one of the things you find when you get into like high density residential stuff is you end up being you're high risk. So because it's based on the number of trips per day, if you're over 1,000 trips per day, it kicks you into high risk. And so it's just been long enough now for me to forget the details, but I'm certain that we did one of those for a private development project with about 200 multifamily units on it.
Wow, because then you got to pay that annual fee forever.
Yeah, but I mean, these are not like, what was the annual fee? I mean, that's still not a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
On a per unit basis.
And then do you know if it was just the multifamily development management, whoever was managing that housing development that did the follow-up every year?
Yeah, the property owner would be required for that. Whether or not they're continuing to do that, I don't know, but they have all the information.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess what a private property owner could at least do is they could probably utilize our new study to be able to justify the location of those UICs on their So that might be of some assistance.
This is Shane with the Walls Group. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we've done plenty of permitting, rural authorization and/or general permits for facilities, commercial mainly, industrial facilities. The process is pretty straightforward. I would say I haven't done much for residential, but for when you get into those higher risks, as Brian was mentioning, yeah, you've got monitoring and sampling that can be triggered, which is ongoing every year. So that becomes an issue or a cost rather onto the property owner. The biggest pain I would say is the new website that has to be used to do this process, which is not user friendly in my opinion. That you could spend a lot of time and effort, and they're aware. I don't know what they're doing about it at this point. There's a lot of not glitches, but it's very quirky, and all the different associations trying to register for somebody and all the authority of what you can do, what you can't do.
Yeah, you mean you're talking about the YDO online system?
Yes.
Yeah,
yep.
We've had some glitches with the city one as well. So.
I guess that once they're coming, I do have another client who does have. They apparently have their own individual permit, and I found this out on one of our sites we were doing because they have a consulting firm that just manages all of their permits, and they add them. I don't know if it's statewide or whatever it is, but they've got an individual permit, and I think that this owner might own the Hickson, some other buildings, and they've added all of their UICs to this individual permit statewide, and that's how that's being done. So some private developers do have their own individual permits.
It's interesting they're allowed to do it statewide.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, they were adding multiple sites to this permit, so I hadn't seen that before either. But I think if you had a property owner that had enough of these, over 50 of them, right, then you probably have one permit that they're managing.
Okay.
I guess it's probably like ODOT, right? They probably have I'm guessing they have a single UIC permit that covers statewide.
All right. And then for that first question, how can regulatory differences between the private and city-owned UICs be best communicated to developers? Is this, do you guys have any recommendations or when we do update those specifications, just maybe 2 separate sections in there, or
maybe I was thinking on the website. Also maybe a summary sheet of, kind of what's required for developers, what's required for private. Just make it really simple on the website.
Checklists are great.
Very explicit.
Yeah. Elizabeth, what might be helpful too is like if we do create like some kind of like checklist or fact sheet, reaching out to the planning department with the pre-application meetings that they hold, I think 4 pre-application meetings a week, 15-minute or 45-minute, just kind of like high level. And that's usually when they first inform the proposed developer of like the stormwater kind of category they're going to be in as far as like what that effort's going to look like. And that might be a good sheet at that time to say, here's an information, about your options about registering this with the DEQ. Could be a good first touch point for the developer.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. Having that because most developers are going to get this through their consultants, but they're going to get firsthand exposure to it at the pre-app. And then if it's standard conditions on their site plan review or land use stuff, there's a whole bunch of boilerplate language that usually goes in the site plan review conditions of approval, and having it there also will get their attention because they will all read that.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that like, that's a great point. Then that locks that condition to their occupancy.
Yep.
And so that occupancy doesn't go until that final checklist is reviewed.
Okay.
I was going to add that I might also suggest including a little tip sheet in pre-application meetings now saying, hey, this is what's coming down the pipeline, because it's hard as, you know, as an architect or something to walk into a meeting and be handed this thing. And I feel like I should have known this, you know what I mean? And to have that prep time so we can start looking into it and educating the clients when they come to us initially, so that there's this, they're aware of this going into it.
Mm-hmm.
That would be great. Some,
Good
you know,
point.
forewarning.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Okay, I think we can go back to the slides.
Jump back in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So these are not really even proposed specifications or standards at this point. This is really just pulling together in a table the different areas that we have in the city, putting that 100-foot setback that we said matched the Oregon Health Authority one, listing in there that minimum 53 foot for outside of perched areas, which is the separation between the regional groundwater table and the bottom of a UIC system. And then for the perched areas, we don't really have that vertical setback because it's a perched zone. So before you could even get to a regional aquifer, you'd be in the perched water. So that's kind of one of the topic areas we wanted to talk about today, is for those perched zones, if we even want to have UICs in them, and also the maximum allowable depth, because 53 feet from the regional aquifer, you know, in some areas that would say that you could go down to 650 feet or whatever, which is not really realistic. So kind of wanting to come up with a number of what is realistic and what is feasible and what is also still protective, because all of these setbacks are for a typical stormwater run-of-the-mill rain event, not for any kind of spill or anything like that.
And I was talking to Elizabeth about this yesterday, and I don't know, I'm assuming it'll hit you guys the same way, but it's so weird when you look at these numbers, because it's like, wait a minute, we'd have more standards for outside of perched areas versus inside perched areas, because in perched areas you're assuming it's already getting to that perched groundwater, and then it's based on a modeling that says, well, even if it gets into that perched groundwater, it's still only going to go so far. And so I just think it's really strange to have like a horizontal and a vertical setback for most areas of town, and then only that same horizontal setback for perched areas.
Right.
And so I think it leads to some of the questions Elizabeth is going to ask, is how we should think about these perched areas. And the report and the modeling was about typical stormwater and typical concentrations in stormwater of particularly PFAS, and how far those typical concentrations would travel over a very long period of time, like 100-year time frame, versus like, what if there's a spill type questions. So anyways, I'm kind of like, sorry, I'm taking your thunder there, Elizabeth.
Oh, that's fine, Lori. And a lot of this does kind of play into the modified dry well discussion coming up as well, because right now UICs, you know, they're really 12 to 20 feet deep. So they would definitely be meeting that vertical setback now. This is really more for kind of the next step, like how far do we want to say how deep things should go or be allowed to be installed. And that way we can have more clear black and white kind of specifications to go off, and resources and maps to base things on, rather than just kind of leaving it open 53 feet from the bottom. That just opens a really big window for anything to be installed. And then the one thing we're for sure not going to change at all is that 2-year time of travel for public drinking water wells for the spill protection we kind of just mentioned. We're not changing those zones at all. We're not going to allow anything within those areas.
Would it be beneficial to add minimum to those, like minimum 53 feet, minimum 100 feet? Just so developers don't say, oh, I'm supposed to be at 53 feet above the groundwater.
That's true. We could be clear about that in the standards. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think we can go to the next slide. So we have a couple more focus questions. I apologize. I don't think these ones were in the agenda. They came about a little later, but should we be allowing UICs in perched groundwater areas, considering typical stormwater versus spills and the fact that there are a lot of privately owned drinking water wells in the perched areas in the north part of town? Second one, should city specification for UICs follow the rule authorization 100-foot depth maximum? Like I mentioned previously, we need to consider the need or feasibility to even go past 100 feet into the ground in like a typical scenario. So kind of wanting the opinion from the subcommittee members, their experience with maybe some of these modified systems. How deep do you actually need to go versus not, and what's realistic? And then for certain situations, should we allow exceptions where things maybe need to go deeper than what is maybe typical? So deeper, maybe deeper than 100. And should we allow that? So kind of just opening up for any discussion or experiences, input from kind of anyone that has done deeper systems, what they think we need in Bend here.
Well, let's start with the first question too. So it's kind of two questions. The first one was about how do folks feel about us allowing UICs to penetrate shallow groundwater areas? You know, what's the comfort level with that based on us having a study that says typical stormwater concentrations, it doesn't look like it's a big deal. So I think we should maybe get folks' pulse on that one first, and then we could talk about the potential deep systems, which are more for those other areas of town, like where there's the welded tough type situations.
That I kind of have a question, Elizabeth, on that. Like just trying to wrap my head around again the modeling that was done that yielded this whole like recommendation for the perched areas. So it's saying we need 53 feet vertically before that perched water level so that the ground, the unsaturated ground, pulls out that PFAS, right? It bonds that PFAS.
No, the 53 feet is about areas where you're not going to hit perched groundwater. So the 53 feet is saying you should have 53 feet between the bottom of a dry well and hitting a groundwater table.
Right.
And then the other part was, well, if you do hit a perched groundwater table, what do you need? Because it's already getting in there. What's the horizontal distance you need to be away from a well?
Gotcha. And that's where I guess my confusion, because Elizabeth, you said there are a number of wells in the perched groundwater table right now. So did they look at it as if like one contaminant particle going in and then going into any well, you know, and they're saying based on their modeling.
So they're saying how far would it travel?
Right.
So the modeling was, so in perched areas, stormwater goes in and it's going in over time, over 100 years. And those, well, they're not really particles, but we'll call them particles of PFAS are moving along. How far do they move in that perched groundwater? And what they said was after 100 years, and it actually was the point where it stabilized, like they don't seem to move any further. The plume doesn't seem to move any further than that. That's what that modeling said.
But is it correct to like understand that recommendation saying I could put a UIC 1 foot away from a well in a perched groundwater area as long as I have 53 feet of separation.
No, it didn't say that. It said you needed 98 feet.
98 feet vertically.
No, horizontally.
Okay.
This is so complicated, right?
So
it says
the perched areas don't have a vertical setback. They only have a horizontal setback because they're assuming that PFAS is within the perched water already.
So I had them flip-flop that it's horizontal, not vertical. That's okay.
Yeah, and what the way we're kind of making it confusing is we're saying let's not use numbers like 98.4 feet and 75.5 feet.
Yeah.
Let's just say and then 29 feet, right? So in the unsaturated, it was you have to be at least 29 feet away. In the perched groundwater areas, you had to be 75.5 or 98.4 feet.
But let's just
horizontally. Let's just call it 100 feet citywide.
Yeah.
Yes. And then that's what suddenly makes it look like, wait a minute. So we have a vertical standard only for areas where there's deep groundwater, but not for areas where there's shallow groundwater, which leads to this question of how do we feel about allowing injecting stormwater into a shallow groundwater table?
Right.
So I'm sorry, we're dominating the conversation. So let's.
No, this is actually really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, are you, if you have 100-foot horizontal setback though, you're not penetrating into that perched groundwater layer if you're set back from that region 100 feet. That was where my head went anyway. You should be outside of that, right?
No, you're saying.
Oh, no, sorry.
Lori's saying it's in it.
Well, setback.
It's in the groundwater. It's the well is the setback. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So by this, you could be 100 feet away from the well, but put your UIC straw straight into the aquifer.
Into the shallow. The shallow.
You can't. Wet foot UICs aren't allowed, so you can't do that either. But
okay, so no wet foot, but it's
you can do 1 foot.
But yeah, it could be really close to it.
But it's saying even with that, even if it gets into that shallow aquifer, that horizontal travel will remove the contaminant.
Yes.
Can I ask a question about that?
Mm-hmm.
So can you educate me or us a little bit more on how that would travel through the water? Just because my understanding of the PFAS is that it doesn't actually ever go away. And so if the water continues to move, I don't understand how any setbacks would be helpful anywhere. It seems like it will just continue to travel and eventually.
It will.
Casey, are you able to answer that question?
Yeah, I was going to say, so it will sorb to particles, so it will still be there, but it can stick to the rocks and clays and materials. It can also be diluted, so you're adding in so much more water that the further you move, it's been diluted, so it's below those limits.
Okay.
The 4 parts per trillion. Yeah.
Okay. And we're okay with it down in the rocks.
I think Stephanie brings up a good point, though, especially for these perched areas where it is kind of already there, and maybe it's a location where we don't want to allow new ones into the future if we know that, there may already be UICs up here in the perch zone, and then adding new ones on top of wherever those setbacks were.
But what that would mean is that there's a significant area. So there's the Mill District kind of area, and then there's the north part of town area. So it's kind of the, Costco area.
It's like everything north of the Butte, right?
It's more
northeast of the Butte.
More like west. Or, yeah. So maybe from Archie Briggs up, would we be saying then no UICs? Like it would have to just be surface disposal of stormwater. So into swales and such. Yeah, this is where, so maybe today, obviously, I think we have some things to really think about on this, but I'd kind of like to hear just folks, how uncomfortable does this make you? Right?
Well, I have a question, and I'll say it does make me uncomfortable. It just allowing PFAS to go into our drinking water. That I realize there are studies that may say it's okay, but just that sentence, it's like, yeah, okay. But
And I want to stop just a second before you continue, is to know when we say into our drinking water, I mean, fortunately, it's not City of Bend's or Avion's drinking water, but it is private wells.
Yeah.
Yes.
So my second question is, what are there any setbacks for UICs or separation setbacks? Because what I could see happening is, I mean, ultimately, you're going to keep allowing UICs in the perched groundwater, and then wells are not allowed within 100 feet of UICs. So now are there going to be situations where people have properties and they can't put a well in because there's UICs too close?
Possibly, yes. Possibly, yes. Hopefully, since we're talking about city, people are connecting to city water.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that could be a scenario. Yes, Mike.
But I think that's a great point, right? Is like, I think to have this final conversation is like, let's look at a map of that perched groundwater area. Let's look at where does city water infrastructure extend within that? Because if there is city water available for frontage, less of a concern, right? But if there's no water service available, are we hindering development for all these people that will need domestic wells, which ideally aren't there anyways? So that might just be the next
layer of study. Yeah.
And is it a fair question to ask? Sorry if I'm just less educated than everybody else on this topic, but is it fair to ask what the alternative is? Like hypothetically, if everyone says, no, don't do this, like what, it's hard to say, it's hard to comment in an educated fashion without knowing what the alternative is.
So the alternative, and I'm interested in folks who do development engineering all the time, but so I mean, obviously you have to dispose of your stormwater.
Right.
it's got to go somewhere.
Right.
So if we said you can't build a UIC in some areas of town, and we don't have, which we don't, a piped system to dispose of that into, what that means is surface disposal. So it means things like swales and ponds, depressions to put the water into to let it slowly infiltrate that way.
Which is kind of what we're doing, I guess. My question then goes back to Casey's comment on so how well does that dissipate if we go that route? It sounds like the UICs potentially are more a higher concentration in a small location versus if everybody's dealing with it individually, it goes into their swale and maybe it's a little bit more dispersed. Am I understanding?
So a typical UIC is, let's say 20 feet deep. So you'd be talking about you're on the surface a couple of feet versus 20 feet deep. So you have that factor of safety added. I know there's some research going on about is there some type of media mix that stormwater could go through and it would remove PFAS? And I went to a stormwater summit by the Association of Clean Water Agencies, and it was really interesting. They had a guy from OSU talking about it, and it depends on the type of PFAS. There's tons of different types of PFAS, and this was all chemistry that I'm not good at, but there's short chain PFAS and long chain PFAS, and it takes different methods to remove them depending on whether it's a short one or a long one. So I think there's a ways to go on figuring out, is there some sort of media, but I'm sure they'll come up with something. I mean, we already have things like cartridge filters where you can send stormwater through it and it'll remove different types of pollutants. So I'm picturing something like that will happen.
But I think to your question, Stephanie, we're trying to give more options on how to manage stormwater. It's really the gist of this, right? So we've had this kind of long running 500 feet, don't go deeper than this. But really, we're trying to say is that accurate? Can we loosen that to help development and help these tough scenarios? And then the other part is that depth factor where looking at deeper UICs, like this kind of takes that first step in like, what is a criteria that manage the contaminants that will then allow us to like reconsider what we allow to be developed. So it's just like, this will, I guess, go into some other like possibly standards, but like really we're trying to loosen what it is. The repercussions would be the status quo now, right? Like 500 feet, like all we're trying to do is look at other options and means of assurances that could.
Yeah, so we're proposing standards that in most areas of town are more lenient than the standards we have now. You'd be able to be closer to a drinking water well because there's such a huge depth to the groundwater, and you're not worried about it getting there. And so really the question is about the areas of town that have the shallower perched groundwater, where we might want to land.
Are the requirements, I don't recall from the slide, but the same for the old mill, the 10-foot perched water and the 100-foot? Because those seem pretty different.
It was 75 for the north area, the horizontal setback, and close to 100 for Old Mill.
But I mean, as far as you're assuming that the UIC, that the PFAS have already reached the groundwater in both scenarios, right? The water table, I should say.
Yeah, and that one's even closer.
Right, when on the deeper groundwater table, you're saying as long as you stay 53 feet vertically away from it, you're okay. So in many scenarios, that perched water table that's 100 feet down, since most UICs are only 20, 30 feet deep,
you're fine.
You're fine. So it seems like those two perched water tables should be treated differently. Like I could see not allowing UICs in the 10-foot deep one, but maybe the 100-foot deep one, it's okay.
That's a great thought, Mike. Thank you. I know we're going to have to get to the next topic, but I know Brian or Shane or Matt, do you guys have any thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I agree with Mike on that, right? Like it kind of depends on what's that vertical separation between the two. And most dry wells are in that, 18 feet deep thing. I think the swales, it's important to note though, when you're doing surface infiltration, they usually also have a depth because we're going to excavate a pond or some sort of facility out of those that could be anywhere from 3 to 10 feet deep, depending. So you're probably discharging directly into a pond without any pre-treatment, at least in the current regulations, whereas a dry well typically does have some sort of sumped, trapped inlet to it. I don't know that you're really gaining, that extra 10 feet of earth is gaining a whole lot there from a sediment or, pollutant removal standpoint. But I think that, looking at those 10-foot separations versus 100 is a totally different story. So.
Casey, a question for you is there been a fate and transport study for vertical attenuation for these particular constituents that we're talking about?
Yeah, so that's the study that Elizabeth was working on. And we had GSA as a sub-consultant working on modeling that. And yeah, that's where those setbacks came from. It's from that study, modeling PFAS specifically and simazine.
The horizontal setbacks are based on that, and vertical setbacks were then determined to be what?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
So I'm understanding the horizontal setbacks, but what about the vertical setbacks for these constituents?
So they were both modeled.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So this isn't. We have a deep groundwater system here, but what do they do in the valley? Is a question I have, where they have shallow groundwater.
So he's asking about how does this impact in the valley where there is shallow groundwater. So maybe talk about the differences between what was modeled here versus if a similar thing was modeled on the west side.
Like a Willamette Valley.
Well, it's
like
completely
difference in
different
geology.
soil characteristics, hydraulic conductivity, absorption, bonding. Like it's all of your input criteria.
Yeah.
So that particulate will differ greatly with whatever media it's traveling through. So I think that's.
Yeah, the input criteria was based on the area. So we did a little bit of research to find, the hydraulic conductivity, the different values for Bend to update the model specifically to our area.
So, okay, this was great. I think there's some really good things to think about in terms of, I like the idea of thinking about treating the Mill District differently than the northern area. Maybe there's like somehow using that maximum depth to groundwater that we limit in the north area of town, that maybe we don't use the deep systems there. We just use standard UICs and that would be fine. I think that was a really good piece of input. So folks, think of anything else, please, continue thinking on this. You have the report. Elizabeth, I'm wondering, should we hold on the 100-foot depth until we go to this other topic?
Yeah, we can cut my stuff off here because it's related to the other presentation. Okay. Thank you for all the input.
Yeah.
Matt has a hand up.
Oh, Matt.
Yeah, I'm a relative newcomer here. I have a question about this map that Audrey posted. What are all these Deschutes County 4A31, all these numbered sites here? Are these dry wells or water wells? What are we looking at in the first water?
Those are water wells.
Okay.
So the number in blue is the depth to water.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't really have a lot to add. Like I said, a newcomer, and I didn't really understand the extent of the perched groundwater table within the city of Bend. How many wells were in it? So getting a sense of what we're actually talking about here is education.
And sorry, I pulled that out of one of the slides from the May meeting, just since it gave a little bit of a geographic footprint reference for this conversation.
And we would plan to use maps like that when we set up these standards. We would have maps. It's not like people have to figure out whether or not there's 53 feet below anything. We would say, if you're in this area, here's the standard that applies. If you're in this area, here's the standard that applies.
All right, so I'm gonna, Rick, maybe I heard you. I was gonna bring the slides back up and turn it over to Trista, unless there was another quick note in there.
No, that sounds great.
Aubrey, maybe I should share my screen. I think I made
some
minor changes to the presentation since I sent it to you.
Please
so let me share screen. And so while I'm doing that, we're switching over to the stormwater master plan. The first topic is really highly related to what we're just talking about for specifications for UICs. And it is specifically about citing criteria for modified dry wells, which are much deeper than a typical dry well. And then we have two other topics to cover. I think given the time, we probably won't get to the third one, so we might have to table that until the next UPAG meeting, which would be okay, but hopefully I'll get a chance to at least introduce you to the idea as we leave. So mostly Casey is going to be, let's see, let me make sure. Are you seeing? Nope, you're seeing my notes, right?
Yeah.
All right. Sorry.
Yeah, it's not presentation view.
I don't know how to switch it so it's.
If you go back to that, Trista, I think it had a couple like icons right underneath, and I think you can toggle there.
Yeah, I think so.
I think I can just do.
Oh, there it is.
Great.
That's it. Your magic now.
Of course, now I've lost my notes for where I can have my Word document open. Here we go. I'm going to move this to the other screen. It's all on the opposite screen. So Casey is actually going to take us through the modified dry well siting criteria and the drill hole decommissioning and retrofit prioritization results. And you got memos for that. But first, we'll just say, just taking it back a little bit. Again, we're talking about the stormwater master plan here. And you've seen these slides before, but these are from the purpose and overview presentation that we did, I think, in March. And so right now we're addressing this bullet to create a long-term plan for reducing risk to groundwater from drill holes and dry wells. And our third topic, which the one we might not get to, is assisting us in this bullet, developing a capital program incorporating conveyance and drainage projects, UIC retrofits, and outfall retrofits. So we might just get to this bullet today. And what we said before about how UPAG input will play into this, and the bolded bullets here are the ones that we'll be discussing today. This continues on our discussion of the visioning. What is most important to you in the community? So some of the comments on prioritization that we'll ask you about in this will go to this bullet, and then solution priorities. How will we prioritize stormwater capital improvements? Same. This is the third topic is specifically about that. And just as a reminder, when we met in May, we did an exercise with UPAG about your values and vision for managing stormwater, and we asked you what you know about how it's funded in Bend, and these were some of the highlights of what we learned at that meeting. The biggest priority we heard from you is to protect groundwater and the Deschutes River. Those tied really, and those were they were much more important in that exercise than reducing, drainage system flooding. And I'm going to also mention that current facilities, repairing them or retrofitting them versus building new ones were rated equally important. And that one of the key hopes you have for the master plan is this bullet here. Whoops, I didn't mean to move slides. Using stormwater management solutions that recognize development density. So our UIC siting criteria goes specifically to that. So if you saw the agenda, you saw our focus questions for these three topics. Do the siting criteria for modified dry wells provide enough flexibility to add these as a tool in the stormwater toolbox in a variety of development scenarios? And then regarding the second topic, which is the process for ranking retrofit or decommissioning of drill holes, this analysis identified 17 high priority locations for that. We're asking you, this is a sense of how fast the city should move through retrofitting or decommissioning those 17 locations. That will give us a sense of how we compare that work against other type of work that we might be recommending in the master plan. So should we do all those in 5 years or 20 years or somewhere in between? And then finally, our focus questions on the CIP rating criteria. I'm just going to hold off on those because I'm not sure we're going to get to that topic. And I'm going to turn it over to Casey to talk about the modified dry well siting criteria.
Yeah, so is there another slide that shows the figure? I think there is. Yeah, so we developed a modified dry well siting criteria. And so modified dry wells are generally up to 100 feet deep. So they're just a little bit different than typical dry wells in that they're deeper. And so in terms of our siting criteria, we were looking at the advantages of modified dry wells are the footprint. They have a smaller footprint and they can bypass those low permeability soil layers, and larger storage volume and improved treatment. And so the criteria that we were looking at residential land use areas, because those are low risk areas. So everything you see in green on this map is areas that we identified as good locations for modified dry wells. So those are residential land use, streets that experience less than 1,000 vehicle trips per day, outside of 2-year time of travel zones, and greater than 500 feet from water wells, and areas outside of perched groundwater. The areas you see in that light yellow color are sort of a moderate risk, where it could be, they would need additional review before being approved, and these areas are residential streets. Oh, sorry. These areas are basically, sorry, I lost my spot. But these areas might have, different trips per day, and they can have moderate land uses.
But that's all residential. Or that's all local streets? Is that what you said?
The green is.
The green is residential.
Mm-hmm.
The yellow's other stuff. So that
Yeah.
could be commercial, mixed use, higher density.
Anything out of the default.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull up the figure because ours has a legend on it, which will be useful. So yellow areas are impervious areas that are outside of 2-year time of travel and greater than 100 feet from water wells. So land use is not included.
And these ones look like they're missing the perched areas too, the yellow.
They are inclusive of the perched areas.
So there was a question in the chat I saw come through.
And that's just our discussion question, so folks have it in hand while we're getting the new information.
Yeah, that's great. Thought you're showing the legend. Thanks.
Yeah, that's the legend. So the idea is, just to reiterate what Casey was saying, is that in the green areas, you could use a modified dry well or deep dry well without additional approval. So as long as you met the design criteria and the setbacks, that the types of things that Elizabeth's talking about, those could get approved without further analysis. And in the yellow areas, you might be able to use this tool, but you need to demonstrate that it is not a threat to groundwater. And we don't know yet. So this is still very planning level recommendations that would be coming out of the stormwater master plan. We don't know yet necessarily what the additional analysis requirements would be. If you wanted to propose a modified dry well in one of these yellow areas, but that information might come after the stormwater master plan is finished and we're in an implementation phase of implementing some of these recommendations.
And then if I could just add kind of like one big picture concept here, right? Like, where do we see the value of deep UICs? I see them in historic corridors where you don't have the footprint available to throw in a huge bed of drain rock, right? Well, those are typically not local residential zoned areas with ADT under 1,000. So I think that's the part we're really looking for some feedback from the group, right? Like, with those deeper, the risk is like spills, right? Like, how are you going to clean up a spill? How are you going to control a spill? Maybe there's uphill pre-treatment we could do, or like capacity or something so that you could respond and plug. But that's a lot of the feedback we're looking for the group, is like, we see the value of these in the locations that pose risks. So how can we allow this tool, but also, mitigate.
And let's give a couple of examples. So some things we've been thinking about to help solve problems we have. So one is kind of the Aubrey Butte thing. Mm-hmm. And Aubrey Butte is a whole bunch of welded tuff. You just can't get infiltration. You got to go a long way down to get it. But that's probably a lot easier than trying to build, I don't know, a surface or pipe system to take all of that water and get it down to Newport and down to the river. So that's one scenario. The other scenario is we have a Midtown Crossings project, which includes looking at Franklin and Greenwood. And as people may know, that's where the road dives under the railroad tracks, and we have the flooding problems when we have a big downpour. And under those railroad crossings, we have like one or two really, really old drill holes that only work so, and our operations folks are worried to death that someday they'll stop working at all. And so what do you do? Every time it rains, you take Vector trucks out and suck all the water out. And so,
but at the same time, you have a railroad,
yes,
with contamination concerns, like riding over the top of that. So it's
right. And the other solution is, so we're looking at potential solutions for that, is put in pump stations, which are very expensive to operate, to pump stormwater out of those low spots, build a very expensive pipe through rock to take it either to the river, which I don't know if we'd get permitted, or there's a huge detention pond, ugly hole in the ground area on Colorado, right on the east side of the parkway, and take it all the way to there. These are millions and millions of dollars solutions versus can we figure out a way to maybe put in some of these deep systems closer to those problem areas, and what would we have to do to feel comfortable building those? Because that would probably be easier to build. It'd still be expensive, but you know, if we put in some big vaults so that if there was a spill and it could be a valve could be turned and those vaults are big enough that it's like, okay, well, it can handle several hundred gallons before it would spill into the modified dry well. So this is why this is a really important question for us, is it's really how we solve some of our big problems. And that's all for me for now.
So though, again, they're like putting this into context. You know, we have all of the stuff that Elizabeth just presented on about what we know about our groundwater table, what we know about contaminant transport, and, you know, some updates on what that is. So we can help, you know, lower some of those restrictions. But then also the big goal, right, is like give the development community more options in management. But with those options, we want to make sure we're not introducing like more risk and things like that. So, you know, we have kind of our cookie cutter default zones that like, yeah, that'll help, but those are usually like greenfield sites anyways, where it's not the biggest challenge to manage this. It's how do we get these as an option with core, you know, higher risk areas that, you know.
And these might just be city capital projects versus maybe this isn't a development standard. Maybe it's a case by case, you can't really do anything else type of standard and have to do some bigger level of pre-treatment or holding. So
I'd also just add some of the disadvantages of modified dry wells compared to drill holes or traditional dry wells are that they have a higher risk of causing groundwater contamination because they're deeper. They're also difficult and expensive to clean, just because you're also having to extract that material from a deeper depth. And they're relatively new, so there's less performance data, and they're more expensive to install than traditional UICs. So just to inform the discussion.
But are there greater disadvantages for modified dry wells versus drill holes?
I couldn't quite hear that, Shane.
I can reframe too. Shane was asking, are there greater disadvantages for modified drill holes versus, so kind of comparing the two sets of solutions, which one has the greater disadvantages?
So Elizabeth can chime in, but I don't think that drill holes are allowed anymore within Bend. So correct?
Right.
Yeah, so it wasn't really within our scope to compare whether drill holes would allowed to be used. So it was really just comparing the modified dry wells to mostly traditional dry wells.
So the disadvantages that Casey mentioned are compared to a typical dry well, not compared to drill holes.
So the modified dry well the drill holes were like 6 inches diameter.
6 to 8, yeah.
Yeah. And so the modified one is a larger diameter, 4 feet?
2 to 4 feet. We're kind of playing with that.
Okay. So a little bit larger diameter, but still drilling down to a much greater depth. And then not having to have the big rock gallery storage area around it.
But of course, right, you get contaminants in there, it's harder to get it out of a deeper hole than a shallower one.
Yeah, and they have some pre-treatment as opposed to drill holes that don't have any.
Right.
Well, if I'm understanding everything correctly, I mean, it seems, going back to Aubrey's question, does it provide enough flexibility? It certainly seems like it's a lot of flexibility. This map is predominantly yellow and green, right? So I think it does.
Well, it's not outright allowed in yellow.
Right.
Yeah, we'd have to figure out what would have to
But
be.
I don't know. It says, you guys said there'd be additional review, but I don't, not knowing what that is, it seems like it.
Yeah.
I'm an optimist, so it seems like if you're in the yellow, you're probably going to get it approved, you know.
Yeah, and Mike, that's kind of our question, I think, to the group is like, we haven't written the list of like, what do you need to tell us to give us that engineering and deeper assessment approval? And so that's kind of like curious if you guys have any feedback, like what we think would be areas of concern that should be addressed in that special case analysis.
Gotcha.
I was
'Cause we-
interested to.
Sorry,
oh,
Tristan.
sorry. I what I heard earlier about the topic that Elizabeth discussed, and the feedback I heard from you who have experience permitting those UICs through DEQ is that you didn't find that process to be particularly burdensome. So I'm wondering if we could, in the implementation of this recommendation, if there would be ways for the city to have something that's no more burdensome than what you experience to get a typical UIC permitted through DEQ when you trigger that individual permit requirement, or even for a private dry well, the rule authorization. I guess my point is there are already times when you've got to demonstrate when you're disposing into the groundwater or into the ground that it's not a default approval. So it's not unheard of that you need to demonstrate for groundwater protection when permitting UICs. So it sounded like it would be okay if the city had some additional requirements or review in these yellow areas.
So it looks like Shane is typing, since probably because we've been having a hard time hearing him. Are you typing something that's a comment, Shane? Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Well, while that's coming through, I guess I have a question for, and maybe it's more directed to Brian. I mean, there's cost involved in all of these things. I know a standard dry well costs around 20 grand, call it, is 100-foot dry well 5 times that cost,
Yeah,
that seems
I had that
pretty
kind of question
deep.
on our sidewalk.
Yeah.
It seems like if you're going into the modified method, you're already in a pickle, right? Like that means you're not able to use standard dry well, and there's something that's driving you to that much more.
Yep.
Just a different design, right? It's going to definitely cost more, but it might be your only option. That's kind of the way I'm viewing this, right? Is we would do standard dry wells everywhere we could. Right. This is something where, for example, by OSU Cascades, I think we had about 26 feet of welded tough before we got into the pumice. If that was 50 feet, that would have been different. They were able to get down to the pumice, but if it was 50 feet, they would not have been able to. That might have been an option for them. Because otherwise the dry well probably would have got 10 times bigger.
Right.
But does a modified, I think what Casey said in the beginning was a modified dry well is inherently 100 feet deep, right?
Not necessarily.
No,
a modified one is you go as deep as you need to go for the water to go away.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
okay. It's not automatically 100 feet deep. Okay. I
generally they're up to 100 feet.
Up to 100. That's very different.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Because Casey, isn't there a private, if you're is that rule authorization 100 feet, or like, isn't there a private UIC criteria about 100 feet?
Yes, that's where the 100 feet comes from. It's under rule authorization. So they'd have to, if somebody wanted to build a private one that was deeper than 100 feet, they'd have to get the general or individual permit. But if we're talking about one that they're building that will be in the right of way, then we can use our study.
And that, I think, then leads into Shane's questions about what are we talking about? And this is a little controversial, but I'm pretty sure per the DEQ today, you could go do a drill hole on site on private property. And that would be something for us to clarify.
A drill hole.
I don't think we have that authority, right? Because they're going to go through and have this like relationship with the DEQ, either rule authorization, permitted or whatever, private entity to the DEQ.
Yeah, I don't think we've asked DEQ that question of are they approving any drill holes versus dry wells. I'm not sure. I know, Elizabeth, have you asked that question?
Can you guys clarify the difference between, because my interaction with civil engineers, dry wells are often called injection holes, drill holes, what is the difference here? When you say drill hole, earlier you said maybe it's a 6-inch hole.
Yeah, a drill hole is an old thing where, like, picture a well driller and they're drilling like a 6 to 8 inch diameter right down into the ground. That's how they built drill holes. It's really just this no different than drilling for a well. And that was it. And then they put on top of it typically just a grate. And so the water goes in and it goes straight down, however deep they felt they needed to go for the water to go away. So that's why we have a lot of those. We have about 1,000 of them that are public. And we don't really want any more of them because they have all kinds of maintenance issues. They don't have pre-treatment, all kinds of stuff. So that's what a drill hole is. Okay. And a dry well is more modern version of underground disposal where it's typically like a 4-foot diameter, like a manhole, right? 4-foot diameter. And it's a manhole with holes in the sides. And then there's gravel around it. And there might also be a gravel storage volume around it as well, because you do calculations like, this can only dispose of so much per second or per minute or whatever rate of disposal. And so we have to have a little bit of storage volume to handle the bigger storms.
But I think both a dry well and a drill hole are a UIC.
They are both a UIC.
Underground injection control. They basically say if it's deeper than it is wide and it puts water in the ground, it's a UIC.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. And so, but you're saying that drill holes are not allowed anymore
in public right of way under our WPCF city managed.
Right. We don't allow them anymore. We have a question of we're not sure if DEQ might approve them on private property.
Well, I don't know if I don't know that anybody's proposing them, but if you went in for like a site plan review and drainage review, I don't know that the city would approve a drill hole on a private development that they have jurisdiction over.
Maybe on a project that's like, I forget what the trigger for like a single family home to go through planning is, like 5,000 square feet or something. Maybe on a project less than that, where you don't have to prove your drainage to anyone. Maybe then
any UIC triggers any UIC triggers a drainage report.
Yeah.
So if you propose a UIC, even if you're at like 2,000 impervious, you're into a drainage full review.
Yeah. So presumably,
but what I'm saying is there shouldn't be drill holes unless there are some kind of cavalier builders out there that are just drilling them on small properties.
That's a good point.
Yep.
That's a good point.
I think one of the things that should also be included too is what about old neighborhoods? So one of the reasons I got involved was because our HOA, our neighborhood is privately maintained. We privately maintain our stormwater and our dry wells are starting to fail. We went in to talk to folks and one of our wells, our first well, is within one of the radius for the drinking well. So they're like, sorry, you can't replace that, but it's failing and it's filling up and the streets are filling up and now the houses are flooding as a result of it. And so I guess I'm just curious, if the HOA land is, that is considered public or private. And we also know we're not the only neighborhood that is having this situation that the dry wells are starting to fail, even though they're privately maintained by the HOAs, and how that all might fit into the discussion.
So currently, those are private systems. So they're not covered by the city's, DEQ, WPCF permit.
Right.
So you'd have to be working with what DEQ allows. And so if you're too close to a private well, then you're kind of stuck. You have to look at more surface type treatment or taking the water to the distance you need it to be away from that well. It would only become a public facility if the city agreed to take that on as a public facility, right, and include it within our permit.
Right.
And we don't have a mechanism or really desire at this point to take on private facilities. We got enough of our own. But I think it's a good point is what are the toolkit items available to you folks? I mean, one might be when, Elizabeth was talking about our study and it allowing a closer distance to wells, that might give you a pathway. It just would have some cost associated with it of having to get like a general permit from DEQ, which she showed you those dollars.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. You get your own permit and then you would use the city study to demonstrate protectiveness of groundwater closer than 100 feet.
So just one more question on clarification, because I'm just trying to get an understanding of the modified dry well. So the difference between the modified dry well and the normal dry well that we usually see with the concrete basin and the perforations and the gravel around is that it's deeper and it does not have the gravel around it, correct?
Great.
Okay.
Yep, you got it.
So, and then splitting that here where that modified to the UIC for the drill hole, right? So you still have, depending on if you go out to like 4-foot diameter or whatever, basically you drill that down, you put a perforated pipe vertical in there, and then you backfill that with drain rock. So depending on your depth, you have that area depth volume of retention. Obviously it's not as, large as like the 15 by 30 drain rock gallery, but at the other time you're creating hydraulic head to like help, drive that infiltration in. You're getting hopefully better chance of like running into a seam, that you actually do get a good layer, knowing like the strata out there. So yeah, there's a little bit of payoffs. And then the other part that we didn't really talk to you, but the current concept of the modified is actually a combined sedimentation manhole and UIC. So basically it has a riser pipe, so the water will come in, and then it's got an oil separator, and then, so you're reducing a structure. So you're trying to, it costs more to build, but you're hopefully knocking out a sed manhole with that.
So is there thought of requiring some sort of like geotech report or something before, maybe that's a requirement in order to do the modified one where you're having,
and that's the means and
drilled.
method.
Yeah.
The means and methods are tough right now, right? Because like traditionally with UICs, like we do a pre-infiltration, right? You open up a big bathtub, dump the water in. Okay, let's make it a little bit bigger, or no, we're good because we got the infiltration. You don't really have that intermediate test with drilling at diameters and depths at this without compromising your hole.
It's hope and luck.
So you're staring at the ground, looking at what's coming out, and here we are at the early stages. Like we've only done 2 pilots, one as a pilot, one that's only drinking water management. So yeah, we don't have a great means and methods of like, what does our, test validation stuff look like?
Well, don't geotech reports show, don't they take cores? I could be wrong, and show, where's welded, how deep is the welded tuff? And then you hit pumice after that,
They
so
do,
at least
but
you would
again,
have
like,
an idea of where the, permeability starts, I guess.
Right. But like, I think right now, like one of the methods we allow when you're doing your drainage design is just like go to the geologic survey, and that's such a broad brush, right? And so, and then like, are we going to dictate the level of geotechnical investigations that need to be done on every single project? Like that's what we're talking about. Like maybe you do need some of that site specific stuff. I don't know. That's kind of where we're at right now. And like, what do we need people to, bring forward for us to look at, and how?
Well, I guess my point of that is like in the green areas where you'll just kind of approve them outright, that's fine. But then the yellow areas, what's that extra criteria? And if they can get a geotechnical engineer out to drill a hole and give a report saying, once you get down to 60 feet or whatever it is, you're past the welded tuff and it's going to drain. Maybe that's one of the criteria for allowing a modified dry well.
No, I think that's a good. I think that's a great
over,
recommendation.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's just the balancing of the cost now, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
you got 2 drill rigs mobilized for that. Like,
yeah,
it's probably
well,
$100,000 facility.
Austin, you mentioned right at the beginning of this last section that the trigger, and I've kind of gone back and forth with UICs or DEQ on this of the trigger of what is a UIC, and it used to be like you said, if it was deeper than it was wide, that's what would trigger it. But recently, we've been told, because often we'll use those horizontal, like half pipe, whatever you call them, underneath.
Yeah.
We've been
sod
told
over the
that,
top.
yeah, we've been told that those are have to be registered with DEQ as well.
Really?
If they're taking anything other than
Roof
direct
runoff.
roof water. Yeah, exactly.
Well,
And
if it's a pipe system that discharges underground, they'll consider that a UIC.
And
Yeah,
Brian,
which
is that
really
because
is
there's
like
no
anything.
but there's no biological breakdown that you would have in an open air swale? That's my only thing that I think makes any sense. But I'm with you. Like, yeah, exactly why that triggers over. The only thing I can think of is just like that.
DEQ has been very inconsistent on this over the years. What they decide is a UIC or not. There's been, if you go back 20, 30 years, it was really crazy. They were trying to say every swale and everything was a UIC, and then finally backed off on that. So there's always that we can't control.
Yeah. Well, because I think that it helps a lot, because we have a lot of projects in, where it's more dense, where we do try to put drainage under the driveway and in these pipes and in the side yards and things like that. But it's great because you can capture the roof water, but sometimes we just have no more room, and you have owners that are like, no, I don't want a UIC that I have to register. And
no, it's a really good point, because maybe it would be nice if they'd consider anything from just residential property to be fine to go in.
Yeah.
Base it on that type of land use rather than just the roof, which I don't even know how great the water is depending on what your roof is built out of. But
yeah. Well, or even the in the right of ways, we've done projects in other states, other municipalities, where we'll line the whole parking lot with these horizontal pipes, and that's the drainage system, and they're not considered UICs there, I guess. So I don't know. That could be another.
That could be an interesting question for us to bring up with DEQ. That might be a good topic for us. So Trista, I know we've like only done one of your topics.
Okay.
5 minutes ago, I was thinking it would be good to skip the second topic and go a little bit to the third, which is just a bit about the criteria. I know you have there's one, I'm looking ahead at the slides secretly. I think you had one slide that talked about the criteria. It's called relative category scores, and I don't know if you want to pull that one up.
Yeah, but I do, for just 1 second, want to talk about the retrofit, the drill hole retrofit, because I don't know that we're going to come back to this at a future meeting. So this one I think is relatively self-explanatory. The city has all these old drill holes, as you heard today. They're not allowed anymore, but there are hundreds. Or what did you say, Lori? 1,000?
About 1,000 of them.
And so they need to be retrofitted. They don't, and some maybe need to be decommissioned. So GSI developed with staff and OTAC a prioritization for which of these is most important to retrofit to protect groundwater. So that's what you'll read in section 3 of the memo that came attached with your meeting materials. And I would say if you have questions on how that prioritization was done, send us an email or some sort of follow-up like that. I don't think we're going to come back to this at a future meeting, because we do kind of need to move on. And this is pure protection. So there's really no downside to this. It's pure protection of groundwater. But if you do have questions about how that prioritization was made, get in, send us an email or something like that. So yeah, in the last 2 minutes, we'll just quickly say capital project prioritization criteria. We're not here yet, but in a couple of months after we get our list of potential capital projects, we are going to need to prioritize them. And so some of the visioning information we heard from you earlier and from city staff, we've turned into this matrix of how are things going to shake out? What are the most important projects? And what you can see here is that we've thought about this in 5 different categories. Does the project address conveyance and flooding? Does it address water quality improvements? Does it have multiple benefits? Like, is it coordinated with Parks and Rec division or something like that? Is it a recognized priority project, either by city staff or the public? And what are the feasibility and cost implications of the project? And so if you look at the maximum score in each category, you can see our most important category is water quality. Tied at 15 is multiple benefits and recognized priorities. And then conveyance of flooding and feasibility and cost both have a maximum of 10 points in the category. There are multiple criteria in each of these categories, which you received in your email. So we'll go over this at the next UPAG. Since we have 1 minute left today, we won't get any further, but we will be asking, is this balance between the categories about right? Is water quality improvement twice as important as conveyance and flooding, for example? So this is a kind of a gut check on how this feels to you. And then we'll also be able to go a little bit further into looking at each criterion in the matrix. We'll take a look at that matrix you got in your packet. Has a lot more detail. So we'll go over that at our next UPAG meeting, as well as a couple of other things about the Stormwater Master Plan.
So many things to talk about.
Yeah, this was a really robust and valuable discussion. I appreciated it.
I think it was too. Boy, I really appreciate you guys being willing to come to an extra meeting and help us think through some of these things that are important for us to be thinking through now rather than waiting on them. So good stuff. So yeah, like Trista said, everybody got packets. I'm sure you have nothing else to do and are reading and holding on to every word in those. But if you do have time and you have any other thoughts, I'm hoping that our discussion today maybe triggered some things, and feel free to share. One of the things you could do is you could just reply all to the meeting invite. And then that way we would all see that. That might be maybe the easiest way to do that. So if you have more thoughts or questions, or like, gee, if you just maybe could tell us this information, this would be a lot easier. Something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Appreciate the
everyone's
feedback.
time.